The golden chandeliers of Mar-a-Lago cast long shadows across the marble floors as Donald Trump adjusted his red tie. Outside, the Florida sun blazed, mercilessly, but inside the air-conditioned sanctuary, power brokers and media, magnates gathered around mahogany tables. The scent of expensive cologne, mixed with Cuban cigars, filled the room as cameras prepared to roll. Trump's eyes gleamed with that familiar confidence, the kind that had carried him through decades of controversy. He cleared his throat, unaware that his next words would ignite a continent. The world held its breath as he leaned into the microphone. "Let me tell you something about Africa," Trump began, his voice carrying that distinctive New York accent. The room fell silent, seasoned journalists sensing something explosive coming. His small hands gestured dismissively as he continued. "Those people over there, they're nothing but scum." The words hung in the air like poison gas, seeping into every corner of the opulent room. Camera flashes erupted like lightning strikes, capturing the moment that would define his legacy. Even his most loyal supporters shifted uncomfortably in their leather chairs. The damage was done irreversible and absolute. Across the Atlantic in the dusty streets of Ouagadougou, a young mother named Aminata was preparing breakfast for her children. Her small radio crackled with the morning news as she stirred millet porridge over a charcoal fire. The BBC correspondent's voice broke through the static, delivering Trump's words with clinical precision. Aminata's wooden spoon clattered to the ground as the full weight of the insult hit her. Her 7-year-old son looked up from his school books, seeing tears in his mother's eyes for the first time. The pain of centuries of colonial humiliation came flooding back in a single devastating moment. The news spread like wildfire across the red earth of Burkina Faso, carried by motorcycle taxis and market vendors. In the presidential palace, Captain Ibrahim Traoré sat in his modest office, surrounded by maps of West Africa and portraits of Thomas Sankara. His aide burst through the door, tablet in hand, face flushed with anger and disbelief. "Captain, you need to see this," he stammered, his voice thick with emotion. Traoré took the device with steady hands, his dark eyes scanning the headlines. As the words registered, his jaw tightened, but his voice remained calm. "Gather the cabinet. It's time Africa reminded the world who we really are." In Lagos, Nigeria, the bustling markets of Alaba felt eerily quiet as vendors huddled around radios. Mama Kem, who had sold fabrics for 30 years, dropped her colorful anchor cloth to the ground. Her weathered hands trembled as she reached for her phone to call her son studying at Harvard. "They think we are nothing," she whispered to her neighbor, her voice breaking with decades of suppressed pain. The other traders gathered around her small stall, their faces a mixture of rage and heartbreak. Children stopped, playing soccer in the narrow alleyways, sensing something had shifted in their world. The proud sounds of Afro beats. Music seemed to fade as reality crashed down upon them. From the highlands of Ethiopia to the townships of South Africa, social media exploded with raw emotion. Young African professionals in Addis Ababa posted videos with tears streaming down their faces, sharing stories of their achievements and dreams. In Johannesburg University, students organized impromptu protests outside the American consulate, carrying signs that read, "We are not scum." The hashtag Bushafrican Dignity began trending worldwide within hours, becoming a rallying cry for millions. Diaspora communities in London, Paris, and New York felt the sting across oceans and continents. The collective wound of an entire people began to bleed through pixels and screens. President Cyril Ramaphosa of South Africa was in a cabinet meeting when his chief of staff rushed in. The room temperature seemed to drop as the news was shared. Seasoned politicians unable to hide their shock. "This is not just about one man's ignorance," Ramaphosa declared, his voice heavy with authority. "This is about centuries of disrespect that we must finally address." His ministers nodded gravely, understanding that this moment would define their generation's response to Western arrogance. Phone calls began flying between African capitals as leaders sought unity in their shared humiliation. The continent's political machinery began to turn with unprecedented solidarity. In the dusty streets of Dar es Salaam, elderly go gathered under the baobab trees to share ancient wisdom. Their traditional drums beat slowly, mournfully, as if announcing the death of patience itself. Our ancestors faced worse insults, said the eldest among them, his voice carrying the weight of generations. But never have we had such power to respond. Young people with smartphones surrounded the wise men live, streaming their words to the world. The old and new Africa began to merge in this moment of crisis. History and modernity prepare to speak with one unified voice. In the presidential palace of Burkina Faso, Ibrahim Traoré sat alone in his Spartan office as dawn broke over. Ouagadougou, the 34-year-old leader, had dismissed his advisors hours ago, needing solitude to process the global insult. His military boots rested on the simple wooden desk. Where Thomas Sankara once planned his revolution, the walls bore no gold or luxury, only maps of Africa and photographs of ordinary Burkinabe citizens. His phone buzzed constantly with calls from world leaders and journalists demanding immediate response. But the young captain understood that silence, like thunder, required the right moment to break. Outside his window, the streets of the capital buzzed with unprecedented energy. As citizens gathered spontaneously, market women abandoned their stalls to march toward the palace, their colorful headscarves creating a river of defiance. University students carried portraits of Pan-African heroes, their young voices chanting songs of resistance their grandparents had taught them. Motorcycle taxi drivers honked their horns in rhythmic solidarity, creating an urban symphony of protest. Even children joined the peaceful demonstration, carrying handmade signs in French and Murray languages. The captain watched his people's pain transform into collective strength, knowing their dignity deserved more than a hasty response. Traoré's chief of staff, Colonel Ouedraogo, entered quietly with a steaming cup of local coffee. The BBC, CNN, Al Jazeera, they all want statements immediately, he reported with barely contained frustration. The young leader sipped the bitter brew, tasting the red earth of his homeland in every drop. Let them wait, Traoré replied calmly, his voice carrying the confidence of a man who understood timing. Our ancestors didn't rush into battle without studying their enemy first. His fingers traced the borders of Burkina Faso on the worn map before him. Strategic patience had served African leaders well throughout history's greatest challenges. As the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across his desk, Tro finally reached for his pen. His aide held his breath, expecting an immediate press release or angry statement to the world. Instead, the captain began writing a letter to his 8-year-old daughter, explaining why dignity sometimes required silence before thunder. When we speak, my dear Fatu, the world will listen, not because we shout loudest, but because we speak truest. He folded the letter carefully, knowing that personal clarity would guide his public response. The weight of representing 54 nations and 1.3 billion people settled on his shoulders like an ancestral calling. In the village of Yako, 90-year-old Mama Zalissa sat beneath the sacred baobab tree where her grandfather once told stories. Her wrinkled hands clutched prayer beads made from seeds her ancestors had planted generations ago. She remembered the French colonial officers who called her people savages while stealing their gold and cotton. The same words, different century. The pattern of disrespect echoing through time like a cursed drum beat. Her great-grandson played nearby, unaware that his future was being shaped by ancient wounds. Reopened, tears fell onto the red earth as she whispered prayers in Moray to ancestors who had endured worse humiliations. Across the continent, the ghosts of Leopold II's Congo seemed to stir in their graves. In Kinshasa, Professor Mackenzie stood before his university students, his voice shaking with controlled fury. They called us lazy. While forcing us to harvest rubber until our hands bled, he declared to the packed auditorium. Historical. Photographs of mutilated Kingal's workers flashed on the screen behind him. Evidence of European civilization. His students, born in freedom, finally understood why their elders carried such deep scars. The professor's words carried the weight of 10 million souls who died for Belgian profits. From the slave castles of Ghana's Cape Coast, the ocean waves seemed to whisper names of forgotten millions. Tour guide Danny led a group of African-American visitors through the dungeons where their ancestors had been branded like cattle. They called us subhuman while building. Their wealth on our backs, he explained, his flashlight illuminating the cramped cells. The visitors touched the walls with trembling fingers, feeling the presence of those who had suffered before them. Trump's words weren't just an insult. They were the continuation of a 500-year-old lie. The Atlantic Ocean had carried both chains and dignity across its vast expanse. In Ethiopia, the land that had never been fully colonized, Emperor Haile Selassie's statue seemed to stand taller today. Addis Ababa streets filled with citizens who remembered their grandfathers' stories of defeating Italian invaders at Adwa. We taught Europe that African soil drinks the blood of invaders, declared an elderly veteran, his medals catching the sunlight. Young Ethiopians gathered around him, hungry for stories of African victory rather than victimization. The legacy of resistance flowed through their veins like sacred water from the Blue Nile. History was preparing to repeat itself, but this time with cameras and global audiences. In the African Union headquarters in Addis Ababa, emergency phones rang through the night like war drums. Secretary General Musa Faki Mohammed paced his office, coordinating with presidents and prime ministers across all 55 member states. The marble floors echoed with urgent footsteps as diplomats rushed between conference rooms carrying sealed documents. Within 6 hours, an unprecedented consensus emerged, something that typically took months of negotiations. President Ramaphosa's voice crackled through secure lines. This insult has done what decades of diplomacy could not. For the first time in modern history, Africa was truly speaking with one voice. From Cairo to Cape Town, from Dar to Dar es Salaam, the continent's youth organized through WhatsApp groups and Twitter spaces. 22-year-old Amara in Nairobi connected with her counterpart, Kofi in Accra, planning synchronized demonstrations across time zones. Their phones glowed with messages in Swahili, Yoruba, Arabic, and French, but their anger translated perfectly across all languages. We are the generation that will not bow. Amara typed her fingers, moving with revolutionary fury. University campuses from Mesa to Cairo buzz with energy not seen since the independence movements. The digital revolution had given African youth a weapon their ancestors could never have imagined. In Rwanda's gleaming capital, President Kagame stood on his balcony overlooking the hills of Kigali, rebuilt from genocide into a modern miracle. His economic advisor delivered the latest statistics. African economies contributing $3 trillion to global GDP. Technology hubs rivaling Silicon Valley. Let them call us scum while begging for our lithium and cobalt, Kagame said with a bitter smile. His phone displayed messages from African billionaires pledging economic solidarity against Western interests. The continent's newfound wealth was no longer just numbers on spreadsheets. It was becoming a weapon. Economic independence was finally within reach, and Trump had just accelerated the timeline. Across the Sahara, traditional rulers who rarely agreed on anything found common ground and shared dignity. The Asani of Ghana spoke with the Oba of Lagos via encrypted video call, their royal regalia symbolizing centuries of African greatness. Ancient kingdoms that predated European civilization began coordinating their response to modern disrespect. Our gold built their cathedrals. Our wisdom filled their libraries. The Asani declared to assembled chiefs. The spiritual power of Africa's traditional authority merged with political urgency. crown and democracy united for the first time, since colonialism had tried to destroy both. The red, white, and green flag of Burkina Faso fluttered in the Harmattan winds as Captain Traoré emerged from the presidential palace. His simple military uniform bore no decorations except the golden star of his nation, a stark contrast to the pomp of Western leaders. Behind him, the statue of Thomas Sankara seemed to nod in approval, the revolutionary's bronze eyes gazing toward a future his protégé was about to shape. Hundreds of journalists from across the globe had descended on Ouagadougou, their cameras creating a forest of lenses and microphones. The young leader walked with measured steps toward the podium, each footfall echoing with the weight of continental expectations. At 34, he was about to speak for over 1 billion people who had been called scum. In the crowd, Mama Aminata stood with her 7-year-old son, the same child who had seen her tears 2 days earlier. Now, her eyes blazed with pride as their captain prepared to defend their dignity. On the world stage, street vendors had closed their shops, teachers had dismissed their classes, and even the busy motorcycle taxis had parked to witness this historic moment. The air vibrated with anticipation as traditional drums began beating ancient rhythms of resistance and renewal. Children perched on their fathers' shoulders, understanding instinctively that they were witnessing history being made. The red dust of Burkina Faso swirled around the gathered masses like incense in a sacred ceremony. Traoré's voice cut through the desert air with surgical precision, speaking first in French, then Murray, finally in perfect English. "Mr. Trump, you have awakened a sleeping giant," he began, his words carrying across continents through satellite feeds. His dark eyes looked directly into the main camera, as if addressing Trump personally rather than speaking to journalists. "You call us scum, but do you know what scum really looks like?" The crowd behind him fell silent, sensing the controlled power in their leader's voice. Even the persistent Ouagadougou wind seemed to pause, allowing every word to reach its intended destination without interference. The world held its breath as the young captain continued, his hand steady on the podium carved from local Iroko wood. "Today I will teach you about the people you have insulted with such casual ignorance." His aide handed him a folder, thick with documents, each page representing centuries of African achievement and dignity. Global news networks interrupted their regular programming, understanding they were witnessing a defining moment in international relations. In Washington, political analysts scrambled to predict the fallout from what was clearly becoming a diplomatic earthquake. The lesson was about to begin, and there would be no escape from the truth. Captain Traoré opened the Iroko wood folder with deliberate precision, his movements choreographed like a master conductor beginning a symphony. "Mr. Trump, let me introduce you to the scum you have never bothered to know," he said, his voice carrying across the silent crowd. The first document he lifted showed a photograph of Dr. Thomas Mensa, the Ghanaian inventor whose fiber optic technology powered Trump's own social media empire. This man's brilliance connects your tweets to the world, yet you call his people worthless. The irony hung in the desert air like morning mist over the Var River. Cameras zoomed in on the document as Traoré held it high for all to see. "Perhaps you recognize this woman," Traoré continued, displaying a portrait of Dr. Hadia Nicole Green, the African-American physicist whose laser technology was revolutionizing cancer treatment. His voice remained steady, professorial, as if teaching a confused child rather than addressing a former president. "Her ancestors torn from this continent you despise now save lives your hospitals cannot cure." The crowd murmured with growing pride as their captain systematically dismantled centuries of ignorance. Journalists frantically typed notes recognizing they were witnessing a masterclass in dignified resistance. The young leader strategy was becoming clear. Education through elevation, not degradation. From the folder came images of African innovations that shaped modern civilization. Ancient meal manuscripts from Timbuktu's universities. Ethiopian mathematics that predated European discovery. Egyptian engineering marvels that still confounded modern architects. While your ancestors lived in caves, ours built libraries that preserved knowledge for humanity, Traoré declared, with quiet authority. His words cut through historical revisionism like a sharp blade through lies woven over centuries. The international media began fact-checking in real time, confirming each claim with growing amazement. Truth was proving more powerful than any insult Trump could manufacture. You speak of scum, Mr. Trump, but I see only reflected ignorance in your words. Traoré concluded his opening argument. The young captain's calm demeanor contrasted sharply with Trump's typical, bombastic style, making the lesson more effective than any angry rebuttal. Behind him, the portrait of Thomas Sankara seemed to smile with ancestral approval at his protege's strategic brilliance. The crowd remained respectfully silent, understanding they were witnessing their leader transform global perception in real time. This was not just a response to an insult, it was a reclamation of African narrative. The world was finally hearing Africa's true voice, unfiltered and unafraid. Traoré reached deeper into his folder, producing economic data that made international financial analysts lean forward in their chairs. Your American economy depends on what you call scum, Mr. Trump, he declared, holding up trade statistics with surgical precision. 60% of your mobile phone minerals come from the Democratic Republic of Congo, cobalt that powers your Tesla vehicles flows from Katanga province. His finger traced numbers. As cameras broadcast the evidence to billions of viewers worldwide, we feed your technology addiction while you feast on the ignorance of calling us worthless. The mathematical precision of his argument left no room for Trump's usual deflection tactics. The captain's voice grew stronger as he unveiled Africa's modern renaissance, each revelation hitting like thunderbolts of truth. Nigeria's Nollywood produces more films annually than your Hollywood, entertaining audiences you have never imagined existed. Behind him, large screens displayed images of gleaming African cities, Kigali's spotless streets, Nairobi's Silicon Savannah, Lagos's bustling financial district. Ghana processes more mobile money transactions per capita than your Federal Reserve handles daily, he continued with mathematical authority. International economists watching live began frantically updating their outdated assumptions about African capabilities. The stereotype of a backward continent crumbled with each precisely delivered fact. From his folder emerged photographs of African medical professionals saving lives across global hospitals during the recent pandemic. Dr. Kismakia Corbett, whose grandparents you would call scum, developed the Mona vaccine that saved millions of American lives, including possibly your own Traoré's words, carried the weight of moral authority as he systematically destroyed Trump's narrative with undeniable evidence. Hospital administrators worldwide recognize the truth, their emergency rooms function because of African-trained doctors and nurses. The young captain had transformed defense into offense, using Trump's own ignorance as a weapon against him. Your space program reaches for stars using calculations first developed in ancient Egypt and Mali. Traoré declared with growing momentum. The folder seemed bottomless, producing evidence of African contributions to every field Trump claimed to value: business, technology, medicine, engineering. We are not scum, Mr. Trump. We are the foundation upon which your civilization stands. Forgotten and unacknowledged is final. Documents showed African students graduating from Harvard, MIT, and Oxford at record rates, returning home to build. The future of the lesson was nearly complete, and the student had become the teacher. Truth had finally found its voice through a young captain in dusty Ouagadougou. Within minutes of Traoré's systematic demolition of Trump's ignorance, social media platforms exploded with unprecedented engagement. The hashtag #YitYourSchools Trump trended in 47 countries, accumulating 10 million interactions in the first hour alone. CNN's chief international correspondent called it the most powerful diplomatic response since Churchill's wartime speeches. European leaders who had remained diplomatically silent began issuing statements supporting Traoré's educational approach over Trump's destructive rhetoric. In university lecture halls, from Oxford to Harvard, professors paused their classes to watch the African captain rewrite international discourse. The world was witnessing a masterclass in dignity, defeating ignorance on the global stage. Across America, African American communities gathered in churches, community centers, and living rooms to watch their ancestral homeland defend their shared dignity. Reverend Jackson, in Atlanta, wiped tears from his eyes as he addressed his congregation. That young man in Africa just spoke for every ancestor who died in silence. Hospital waiting rooms fell quiet as staff and patients alike watched the broadcast on wall-mounted televisions. Even Trump supporters found themselves unable to argue with the mathematical precision of Traoré's evidence-based response. The captain had done something remarkable. He made facts feel like poetry, truth sound like music. America was seeing Africa clearly for perhaps the first time in centuries. In European capitals, foreign ministers convened emergency meetings to reassess their African policies in light of Traoré's revelations. The British museums. Directors stared nervously at the benign bronzes, wondering if the young captain might next address centuries of cultural theft. French President Macron canceled his afternoon appointments, instructing his African affairs team to prepare comprehensive briefings on modern African achievements. German automotive executives realized their entire electric vehicle revolution depended on Kingal's cobalt and Zimbabwean lithium. The colonial mindset was crumbling in real time as Europe confronted its willful blindness. Africa was no longer asking for respect. It was demanding recognition of what had always been true. In Beijing and Moscow government, officials watched with strategic interest as America's global influence suffered another self-inflicted wound. Chinese economists had long recognized Africa's potential, investing billions in infrastructure while America traded in stereotypes. Putin's advisors noted how one African leader's dignity had accomplished what years of propaganda could not. The global balance of power was shifting, and Trump's ignorant words had accelerated a process that was already inevitable. Africa was rising, and the world was finally paying attention to the continent they had dismissed for too long. Captain Traoré closed his folder with the same deliberate precision with which he had opened it, the sound echoing like a judge's gavel ending a trial. "Mr. Trump, your lesson is complete," he declared, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a teacher who had just educated the world's biggest bully. The crowd behind him erupted in thunderous applause that seemed to shake the very foundations of Ouagadougou, their voices creating a symphony of vindicated pride. Children who had felt ashamed of their continent that morning now stood tall, their backs straight with newfound dignity. The young captain had not just defended Africa, he had wrested its rightful place in global consciousness. History would remember this moment as the day Africa stopped explaining itself and started teaching the world. Within hours, Trump's social media platforms fell silent. For the first time in years, his usual Twitter storms conspicuously absent. Political analysts across America noted the unprecedented quiet from Mar-a-Lago, suggesting even Trump understood he had been thoroughly outclassed. Republican senators who had laughed at his initial comments now scrambled to distance themselves from the international embarrassment. The former president's own advisors reportedly urged him to apologize, recognizing that Traoré's masterful response had turned Trump into a global laughingstock. For once in his life, the man who claimed to know everything had nothing to say. The student had definitively become the teacher, and the lesson had been learned by billions. Across Africa, celebrations erupted from Cairo to Cape Town as the continent collectively exhaled centuries of held breath. In Nairobi streets, young people danced to Afrobeats music with renewed pride, their movement celebrating not just Traoré's victory, but their own rediscovered dignity. Markets that had closed for the speech remained, shuddered as vendors joined impromptu street parties honoring their continental champion. University students painted murals of the young captain alongside Thomas Sankara, creating visual testimony to African leadership's evolution. The shame that had carried across generations finally lifted, replaced by the unshakable knowledge that they were worthy of respect. Africa had found its voice, and the world would never silence it again. In the quiet of his presidential office that evening, Traoré sat alone reading bedtime stories to his daughter over video call. "Papa, the whole world is talking about you," 8-year-old Fadu said with sleepy pride in her voice. "They're not talking about me, my dear. They're finally talking about us," he replied, his voice soft with paternal love and continental responsibility. Outside his window, the streets of Ouagadougou still buzzed with celebration as his people savored their restored dignity. The young captain had kept his promise to his ancestors and his children. Simultaneously, tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight Africa could sleep with pride, intact and heads held high. Captain Traoré proved that dignity and facts triumph over ignorance and insults. Africa's youth showed the world their true strength, not through anger, but through education and pride. What did you think of this powerful lesson? Subscribe for more inspiring African stories and share your thoughts in the comments below.